Welcome back to the deep dive. We often sit around and talk about economies growing. We see the GDP numbers flashing across the news ticker, or we see stock markets rallying, or honestly, we're just complaining about the price of onions going up again.
Right. It's usually the onions.
It really is. But have you ever stopped to ask the fundamental machine code question of how a country actually grows? I mean, it isn't magic. It isn't just a politician signing a decree or a central bank printing a bunch of money. At its core, it is a very physical cycle.
It's a physical cycle of savings leading to investment, which leads to capital formation.
Exactly. But here's the catch, and this is exactly what we are digging into today. How we invest matters just as much as how much we invest. I mean, whether the government builds everything like this giant monolith, or whether it invites the private sector to share the load, that single decision completely changes the destiny of a nation.
Precisely. It is the difference between a command economy and a market economy. And India is super unique here because we have lived through this fascinating and sometimes really painful but ultimately triumphant transition between those two extremes. Today we're going to unpack exactly how that transition happened, where we currently stand, and honestly where we're going next.
Absolutely. And before we dive into the nuts and bolts of all that, I want to give a massive welcome to everyone listening to this special series. You are listening to The Deep Dive, specifically the full summary for UPSC focused by Simplified UPSC by PPP YouTube channel series. We are thrilled to have you here with us.
It is an absolute pleasure to be here to break this all down for you.
Now, a quick but very important request for our listeners. If you find value in these deep dives, they help you decode the complex world of economics without putting you to sleep, please, we humbly ask you to subscribe to the Simplified UPSC by PPP channel. It really is what keeps this content coming.
Yeah, the subscriptions make a huge difference to the algorithm.
They do. Yeah. And if you are capable, I mean, strictly only if you're capable, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. It ensures the team behind the scenes can keep the lights on and keep bringing you these super useful deep dives.
And we really have to give a massive shout out to all the current Patreon supporters. You guys truly are the backbone of this entire initiative. We couldn't do the deep research without you.
100%. Also, don't forget to like this video and share your valuable comments. Tell us what you think. And just so you know, free notes with practice inebriations. Previous year questions, or PYQs, are available right now on the public Telegram channel.
But if you want the full experience, right, the really comprehensive stuff.
Exactly. If you want access to all the videos in this series at once, plus the organized premium notes, which include detailed breakdowns, extra PYQs, and even model mains answers, you can join the private Telegram library. Just DM the public Telegram channel to join that. It's a game changer for your prep.
It sounds like an invaluable resource for anyone serious about mastering this topic, especially for the mains examination where the nuance really matters.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. Today's mission is to decode Chapter 11. Investment models from Sanjeev Verma's Indian economy. But we aren't just stopping there, are we?
No, we really can't. To do this justice, we are also weaving in the detailed technical breakdowns from Vivek Singh's Indian economy, specifically Chapter 14. We need to make sure we understand the alphabet soup of investment models, things like HAM, EPC, BOT, until they are absolutely crystal clear for you.
So we are going to move through the traditional models, the shift to neo-investment models, and then spend a really good chunk of time on public-private partnership, or PPP, which is really the engine of modern infrastructure.
Right. PPP is where the bulk of the complex questions come from.
So let's start at the very beginning. Section 1, the engine of growth. How does this macro machine actually work? Because we hear the word investment, and we usually just think about putting money into the stock market or buying a mutual fund. But in economics, it's not just money, is it?
No, and that's the very first trap that students fall into. If you look at Sanjeev Verma's context, it starts with a very simple macro cycle. Income leads to savings. Savings leads to investment. Investment leads to output, which then circles back to increased income. It is a continuous loop. But the definition of the word investment here is the key.
I like to think of this loop like a flywheel, those massive, heavy wheels and engines. You need savings to push the wheel initially. That's your investment. That push generates speed, which is your economic growth or output. And the faster it spins, the easier it is to push the next time around because you have more income.
That is a brilliant analogy, and it explains the entire early history of the Indian economy perfectly. Pre-reforms, India was completely trapped in what economists call a low-growth cycle.
Because the flywheel was too heavy to push.
Exactly. Because national income was low, domestic savings were incredibly low. Because savings were low, there was no capital for investment. And without investment, you simply cannot have high output. This trapped India in what was famously and somewhat notoriously called the Hindu rate of growth, which hovered around 3.5% for decades. The flywheel was barely even moving.
But wait, when we say investment in this context, we need to be really careful with our definitions, right? Because if I go out and buy 100 shares of Reliance right now, or if I buy a fancy secondhand car, I'd tell my friends I just invested my bonus. But an economist doesn't see it that way.
Not at all. And this is a crucial distinction, one that actually links directly to a 2020 Mains PYQ. The question asked you to, and I quote, explain the meaning of investment in an economy in terms of capital formation.
Oh, that's a tricky wording if you just think of stocks.
Very tricky. In macroeconomics, buying shares in the secondary market is just a transfer of ownership. You are giving someone cash, and they are giving you a piece of paper. You aren't creating anything new in the physical world, you are just swapping money for a financial claim. True investment, which we call gross capital formation, means building physical factories, constructing highways, buying brand new machinery.
You are increasing the actual productive capacity of the country.
Yes, you are building the tools that will make the things.
So what if I buy gold or jewelry? Because, we Indians absolutely love buying gold. It's our default investment.
And that is deeply cultural, but macroeconomically, it is treated as consumption or savings in the traditional sense, specifically categorized under valuables. It sits in a bank locker. It doesn't produce any goods or services.
It just looks shiny.
Exactly. Capital formation creates assets that produce other goods. That is the engine. If you buy a heavy-duty sewing machine that makes 1,000 pairs of shoes a day, that is capital formation. If you buy a gold necklace, that is just holding an asset to hedge against inflation.
Got it. So for a country to actually grow and pull people out of poverty, we need to build factories and roads and ports. But the massive question is who builds them? That takes us to Section 2, traditional investment models.
Yeah.
It seems there were two main competing schools of thought back in the day, right after independence.
Yes. Broadly speaking, you had the top-down model and the bottom-up model. And the philosophical choice between them pretty much defined the first 40 years of independent India.
Let's start with top-down. This is the heavy lifting approach, right?
Exactly. This is the model India ultimately chose post-independence, and it was heavily influenced by the Soviet command model and the Herdomar growth model. We officially call it the Mahalanobis model, strongly associated with the second five-year plan. The pure logic of it is to focus all your limited resources on the core, heavy industries first.
We're talking steel, cement, power generation, crude oil refineries.
Correct. Big, massive, capital-intensive projects. The prevailing belief was that if you build the mother industries, the downstream industries, like consumer goods, will just naturally follow. It's a trickle-down effect of industrial capability. They essentially thought, let's build the heavy skeleton of the economy, and the consumer flesh will just grow around it.
I mean, the idea being if you have domestic steel, then you can build domestic machines. And if you have machines, then local entrepreneurs can build textiles or bicycles or cars.
Exactly.
And what was the alternative? The bottom-up model. Because I know Gandhi had very different views on industrialization, and there were prominent economists supporting that decentralized view, too.
This was the fascinating path not taken. It was championed by the Bombay School economists, primarily Vakil and Brahmanand, and yes, it had very deep roots in Gandhian economics. Their core logic was incredibly pragmatic. They looked at India and said, we have a massive, unskilled labor force and virtually zero capital. So why on earth are we building highly automated, capital-intensive steel plants that employ very few people?
Right, because a steel plant costs billions, but maybe only employs a few thousand engineers and workers.
Exactly. Their argument was to focus on small village-level industries, produce what they called wage goods. These are simple, everyday things people need immediately, like cotton clothes, basic processed food, simple agricultural tools, leather goods.
So use the massive population to make the things that the massive population needs to buy immediately. It generates widespread employment right now in the villages instead of migrating everyone to a steel town.
Yes. Generate immediate localized income and employment, and then as people save from those wages, you slowly, organically scale up to the heavy machinery once the population actually has money in their pockets to demand more complex goods. It's a heavily demand-side approach compared to Mahalanobis.
It sounds incredible.
The key word you have to understand here is self-reliance. You really have to put yourself in the geopolitical context of the 1950s. We had just painstakingly clawed our way out of 200 years of extractive colonialism. We absolutely did not want to depend on the West for our steel, our defense equipment, our heavy machinery.
Because if you rely on imports for your core strategic industries, you are politically vulnerable.
Highly vulnerable. If a foreign power cuts off your steel supply, your country stops functioning. We wanted true strategic independence. We wanted to stand on our own 2 feet as an industrial power, even if it meant starving the consumer sector and stumbling for a few decades.
That makes historical sense. But clearly, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, there were massive flaws in execution. Sanjeev Verma is pretty intensely critical of this phase in his book, right?
He is, and the critique is very substantial for UPSC aspirants to grasp. First, there was a massive resource constraint. The government relied entirely on public savings and taxation to fund these colossal steel plants and dams. But as we just discussed, national income was tiny, so public savings were tiny. We simply didn't have the domestic money to fund it all without printing money or heavily borrowing.
And second, there was a massive technology and efficiency gap.
Exactly. Because it was a state monopoly, we focused purely on capacity creation. We just wanted to build the plant and say, we have a plant. We didn't focus on efficiency or global competitiveness. We weren't trying to be the best or cheapest steel producer in the world. We just wanted to physically be a steel producer.
And the public sector undertakings, the PSUs that ran these plants, they didn't exactly run like lean, agile startups, did they?
Far from it. They completely lacked the profit motive. Worse, they were burdened with intense social obligations. Politicians forced them to hire way more people than technically necessary just to provide government jobs. This massive bloat meant they couldn't generate a financial surplus.
And if they don't have a surplus, they have no profit to reinvest.
Precisely. So that economic flywheel we talked about, it became incredibly heavy and completely stuck in the mud. And because we operated a closed economy with high import tariffs, there was zero foreign competition to force these PSUs to upgrade their technology or cut costs. They were absolute monopolies, and monopolies rarely innovate unless they are absolutely forced to.
Which brings us perfectly to 1991. The balance of payments crisis, the historic reforms, and the massive shift to Section 3, neo-investment models. This is where the private sector finally gets invited off the bench and into the game.
It was a total paradigm shift. We decisively moved from controlling the command heights, where the state actively owned and controlled everything, to a market-driven economy. In administrative terms, the government moved from being the rower of the boat to being the steerer. And the first major shift was the aggressive entry of private sector investment.
And this wasn't just about quantity, right? It was a fundamental shift toward quality.
Exactly. It moved from a quantitative mindset, just building more tons of capacity regardless of cost, to a qualitative mindset, which means building efficiently. The private sector is ruthlessly driven by profit. And to make a profit in a competitive open market, you have to be highly efficient. They take those profits and reinvest them. We call that plowback. This creates supplementary core investment that the government doesn't have to fund.
Now, this era also threw open the doors to foreign money. And this is where it gets really interesting for the exam and slightly technical. We really need to clearly distinguish between FDI and FPI.
You're right. This is an absolute favorite topic for UPSC, both in prelims and mains, and for good reason. It practically determines the stability of our entire external sector and our currency. Let's start with FDI, foreign direct investment. I always tell students to think of this as a marriage. It is long-term, it's committed. Legally, it involves taking management control, which is usually defined by the RBI as taking a stake of more than 10% in an Indian company.
So if a giant like Walmart comes in and buys a massive controlling chunk of Flipkart, that's FDI.
Correct. And the true benefit of FDI isn't actually just the foreign dollars coming in. It's what economists call the knowledge spillover.
Meaning they bring their brains, not just their wallets.
Exactly. Walmart brings state-of-the-art logistics technology, global supply chain management, inventory tracking software. That knowledge spills over to Indian workers and competing Indian firms. So FDI fills our domestic savings investment gap, and it aggressively upgrades our technology. This can happen through a wholly owned subsidiary where they own 100%, or through joint ventures with an Indian partner.
Okay, that makes sense. Then what exactly is FPI, foreign portfolio investment?
Well, if FDI is a long-term marriage, FPI is dating, or honestly, maybe even speed dating. This is purely investment in financial assets. It's a foreign hedge fund sitting in New York buying stocks or government bonds on the Bombay Stock Exchange. They have absolutely no interest in management control. They usually buy less than 10%.
They just want a return on their capital.
Right. Now, FPI provides massive liquidity to our stock markets, which is generally good. It deepens the capital market and helps Indian companies raise funds via IPOs, but the inherent risk is exceptionally high.
These are the fair weather friends of the economy.
That is the perfect term. They are highly volatile. If the U.S. Federal Reserve suddenly decides to raise interest rates, that FPI money flows out of the Indian stock market and flies back to the U.S. overnight. Why? Because they can get better, safer returns in U.S. Treasury bonds with zero emerging market risk. We saw this massive capital flight during the taper tantrum of 2013 and during recent rate hike cycles.
So the fundamental difference is physical versus financial. FDI builds a giant automobile factory in today. You can't exactly pack up a factory and put it on a plane overnight if you get scared. But FPI buys 1 million shares of an auto company. You can sell that with one click on a computer terminal.
That's a brilliant way to visualize it for the exam. Now, moving along within this neo-investment phase, the government realized they couldn't fix the whole country's infrastructure overnight. So we saw the rise of specific geographic zones, SEZs, NIMZs. What was the core logic there? Agglomeration. The blunt logic was India's infrastructure, our roads, our power grids, our ports, was pretty terrible everywhere. We physically and financially couldn't fix the whole subcontinent at once. So the strategy was, let's fix it perfectly for very small, walled-off enclaves. SEZs, or special economic zones, were directly modeled on the massive success of China's coastal zones. You give these zones 10-year tax holidays, uninterrupted 24/7 electricity, single-window clearances, and world-class internal roads, but they have to be strictly export-oriented.
But looking at the data, did it work as well for us as it did for China?
Sadly, not really. We made some crucial policy errors. We made our SEZs way too small, sometimes just a single IT building, and they were scattered randomly based on political lobbying rather than logistical sense. China built massive city-sized zones near deep water ports. But our policy evolution continued to learn from this. We moved to NMIZs, National Manufacturing Investment Zones.
How are those different?
They were envisioned as much larger, holistic industrial townships, and today they have largely been integrated into what the government calls integrated manufacturing clusters, or IMCs. The big idea here is cluster investment. If you are trying to promote the leather export industry, don't encourage one factory to open in Punjab and another in Tamil Nadu. Group 50 of them together in one mega park in Kanpur.
Because then they can share the massive fixed cost.
Exactly. They can share a single, expensive water effluent treatment plant. They can share dedicated freight railway sidings. They benefit from a shared, highly skilled local labor pool. It reduces operational costs for everyone significantly and makes our exports globally competitive.
Okay, so we have the private sector heavily involved now. But there are some things like building a multi-billion-dollar expressway or a massive new international airport where the private sector might be terrified to go it alone because of the upfront cost and risk are just astronomical. And conversely, the government can't do it alone because they lack the budget and the operational efficiency. Enter Section 4, Public-Private Partnership, or PPP.
This is the absolute core discussion for modern Indian infrastructure.
Yeah.
And before we dodge into the alphabet soup of models, we need to clear up a massive misconception that students have. PPP is not privatization. Let me repeat that. It is not privatization.
Right, because in wholesale privatization, like the sale of Air India, the government sells the asset, takes the cash, and completely walks away. In a PPP, the government is still the ultimate owner of the asset, usually.
Correct. It is a long-term, legally binding partnership between a government entity and a private company to design, build, finance, or operate a public asset or service. The key foundational document here is the concession agreement. If you are preparing for your mains exam, this document is your Bible. It meticulously defines who takes which risk over a 30 or 40-year period.
Risk sharing, that is the fundamental underlying principle of every PPP.
Exactly. Ideally, in a well-drafted concession agreement, risks should be allocated to the party best suited to manage and mitigate them. Think about it. The private sector is incredibly good at rapid construction, operational efficiency, and deploying technology. So they should take the construction risk and the operation risk.
And what about the government?
The public sector, the state, is the only entity that has the sovereign power to legally acquire farmland or grant complex environmental and forest clearances. So they must take the land acquisition risk and the regulatory risk. If a private company has to run around getting forest clearances, the project will stall for a decade.
But it's never quite that simple on the ground, is it? We have this incredibly dense alphabet soup of models in Vivek Singh's book EPC, BOTHMATOT. Let's break these down one by one, because this is where students often get hopelessly confused. Let's start with the most basic one. EPC, Engineering, Procurement, Construction.
So, technically speaking, EPC is not a PPP in the true philosophical sense of long-term risk sharing. In a pure EPC contract, the government pays 100% of the money out of its own budget. The private player is basically just a hired contractor.
So it's exactly like me hiring a local contractor to build my house. I buy the bricks, I pay him for his labor, he builds it, hands me the keys, and we're done.
That is the perfect analogy. The government takes all the long-term risk. If it's a toll road and there's absolutely no traffic on the road once it opens, the government loses all that money, not the private builder. The builder already got paid. We typically use EPC when private players are too scared to invest their own money, which is actually happening right now in some specific sectors. For example, a lot of the grand railway station redevelopment projects in Mumbai and Delhi are currently shifting back to pure EPC because private real estate players are just too risk-averse in the current climate to put up their own capital.
Okay, so EPC is basically government-funded contracting. Next level up in complexity, BOT, Build, Operate, Transfer. This is the classic PPP.
Yeah. Here, the private player designs the project, builds it with their own equity and money they borrowed from banks. They then operate and maintain it for a long concession period, say 30 years. And at the end of 30 years, they transfer the fully functioning asset back to the government for free. Now, there are two distinct flavors of BOT that you must know. First is BOT toll.
Under BOT toll, the private player recovers their massive investment by physically collecting the toll from the cars driving on the road.
Exactly. So their entire profit completely depends on how many cars drive by every single day. That is called taking the traffic risk, or demand risk.
And this is where the entire Indian road sector basically collapsed a few years ago, right?
Yes, it was a massive crisis. During the economic boom years before 2008, private infrastructure companies were overly optimistic. They bid insanely aggressively to win these highway contracts, assuming that commercial traffic would magically grow at 15% every single year forever. But then the economy slowed down, the traffic didn't materialize.
So they weren't collecting enough toll to even pay the interest on their bank loans.
Exactly. Private players started bleeding cash and going bankrupt. Massive banks were stuck with billions in bad loans. Because of this, banks completely stopped lending to road projects. Private players stopped bidding. The entire national highway construction program literally ground to a halt. It was a gridlock.
So the government desperately needed a middle ground. They needed private efficiency, but the private guys wouldn't take the traffic risk anymore. Enter what they call the game changer. AIR-M, the hybrid annuity model.
This was a brilliant piece of financial engineering to solve the stalled road projects under the Faratmala program. It's a hybrid. It mixes elements of EPC, which is government funding, and elements of annuity, which are fixed government payouts over time. Specifically, it uses a 40-60 split.
How exactly does that work? Walk us through the physical money flow, step by step.
Okay, imagine a highway costs 100 crores to build. Under HAM, the government pays 40% of the project, costs so 40 crores in staggered milestones during the actual construction phase. This gives the private builder massive upfront cash flow, meaning they don't have to borrow as much expensive money from banks.
Okay, so the road is built. What about the remaining 60 crores they're owed?
The remaining 60% is paid by the government as an annuity. Think of an annuity like a guaranteed pension. The government pays the builder a fixed, pre-decided amount every 6 months for the next 15 years, plus interest.
So the private player doesn't have to put up toll booths. They don't care if one single car drives by or a million cars drive by.
Exactly. The government or the National Highways Authority of India, NHAI, collects the toll, if there is any, and the government takes 100% of the traffic risk. The private player just has to ensure the road is built with high quality and that it doesn't get potholes, because if they don't maintain it, the government will deduct money from their annuity. This completely revived highway construction. Banks were suddenly willing to lend again because the future payment wasn't dependent on risky toll collections. It was guaranteed by the sovereign government.
That is a fascinating adjustment. It really shows that policymaking is rarely perfect on the first try. It has to be iterative. Now, Vivek Singh also mentions the Swiss challenge model. That sounds very exotic. What is that?
It's a very interesting procurement method. It deals specifically with unsolicited proposals. Imagine a private engineering company does its own secret research and goes to the government and says, hey, we found an incredible spot for a deep water port, and we have already done the complex math and engineering designs. It will cost this much. Let us build it.
But the government can't just hand them a multi-billion-dollar contract behind closed doors. That would look like massive corruption.
Right, there would be an outcry. It has to be transparent. So the government accepts the brilliant idea, but they openly publish the details and open it to competitive bidding from the whole world. Anyone can bid to build that port.
But wait, doesn't that punish the original guy who spent millions researching the idea?
That's where the Swiss challenge part comes in. The original proposer is given what's legally called the right of first refusal. If some rival company comes in and bids a lower, more efficient price, the government goes back to the original guy and says, hey, they bid lower. If you can match their low price, the contract is yours. If you can't, the rival gets it.
Ah. So it hugely encourages private innovation because companies are motivated to scout out new infrastructure ideas knowing they have a massive built-in advantage to win the final contract.
Exactly. It brings private sector creativity into public planning.
Let's talk about VGF, viability gap funding. Because sometimes a project is just a guaranteed money loser, right?
Yes. VGF is specifically for projects that are highly socially necessary but economically unviable on paper. Imagine a massive bridge connecting a very remote, poor tribal district to a main city. The traffic volume will be so low that no private company could ever recover their costs through tolls. But the state knows the people desperately need that bridge for healthcare and education access.
So no private player will touch it.
Right. So the government says, go ahead and bid to build it, private sector. We know you will lose money. So we will give you a massive one-time cash grant, sometimes up to 20 or 40% of the total project cost, just to make your internal rate of return, your profit math, actually work. It literally bridges the financial gap between a project being unviable and viable.
Okay, finally in this section, we hear a lot in the news lately about asset monetization and TOT, toll operate transfer. This is totally different from building new stuff, isn't it?
Yes, this is a massive shift in strategy. This is entirely about brownfield assets. Brownfield means things that are already fully constructed and operational. The government looks at its portfolio and says, look, NHAI built this amazing 6-lane highway 10 years ago. It's earning a steady toll every day. But we desperately need a giant lump sum of cash right now to go build a brand new greenfield highway in the Northeast.
So they sell the highway.
No, they never sell the ownership of the land. They lease the economic rights. They lease the existing highway to an international pension fund or a private player for, say, 30 years. In exchange, the private player writes a massive upfront check to the government. We're talking thousands of crores.
Yeah.
And for the next 30 years, that private player gets to keep all the daily toll collections.
So it's basically recycling capital, unlocking the trapped cash from old infrastructure to fund the new infrastructure.
Precisely. It's a very smart way to fund the national infrastructure pipeline without drastically increasing the government's fiscal deficit or borrowing more money.
Okay, so we've covered the theoretical models. Now let's look at how these actually play out on the messy ground reality. Section 5, Sector-Specific Deep Dive. This is where Vivek Singh's source material is so rich. Let's start with roads, which we just touched on.
Roads are basically the classic textbook case study for India's PPP evolution. As we discussed, we went from the euphoria of BOT toll, which crashed and burned due to traffic risk, to the safety of EPC, which completely drained the government budget, to finally arriving at AM, which beautifully balanced the risk. It traces the exact maturity curve of Indian infrastructure policy.
About railways. That's a massive, complex beast. Historically, it's been a pure government monopoly.
Railways is much tougher for PPP because it's fundamentally a public utility with highly subsidized passenger fares. No private player wants to run a service where the government forces them to charge a fraction of the actual cost. But we are seeing structural movement. Look at the massive dedicated freight corridors, the DFCs. The Eastern Corridor was heavily funded by the World Bank, while the Western Corridor relied on massive Japanese funding through JICA.
And what about the actual passenger stations? They're starting to look very different.
Yes, station redevelopment is a huge focus. The Habibganj station in Bhopal, which is now renamed Rani Kamlapati, was the first major PPP station redevelopment. If you go there, it literally looks and feels like an airport terminal. It has premium retail malls, executive lounges, segregated arrival and departure concourses so people don't bump into each other. The private developer recoups their cost by commercializing the real estate in and around the station.
And what about actual train operations? I remember hearing about private trains.
That was the Tejas Express experiment. The government allowed private entities, well, technically IRCTC acting somewhat independently, to run premium trains. They could set their own dynamic fares and offer airline-style food and hospitality. It had very mixed results, largely because private players felt that the Indian Railways was both the regulator setting the rules and a direct competitor running rival trains on the same tracks. But it clearly showed the government's intent to eventually open up operations, not just station construction.
Speaking of things that look like airports, let's talk about actual airports. I mean, the contrast between an old government-run airport and the modern Delhi and Mumbai terminals is staggering. That's a massive PPP success story, right?
Unquestionably, that operates on the revenue share model. Years ago, when the government decided to modernize the Delhi airport, the primary bidding criterion was beautifully simple. Who will share the highest percentage of their top-line gross revenue with the government? The GMR consortium won because they offered a staggering revenue share of 45.99% to the Airports Authority of India, or AAI.
Wait, almost half of every single rupee they earn, from parking, from duty-free shops, from airline fees, goes directly to the government.
Yes, it generates massive cash for AAI. And the brilliant part is AAI uses that huge windfall from Delhi and Mumbai to cross-subsidize and maintain dozens of smaller, unprofitable airports in Tier 3 cities across India. However, for the newer rounds of airport privatization, like Lucknow or Ahmedabad, they shifted the model. They moved to a per-passenger fee model.
Why change it if the revenue share was making so much money?
Because defining what constitutes gross revenue became a massive accounting nightmare and led to endless lawsuits. The private operators would set up subsidiary companies to hide revenue, so the government simplified it. Now, the bidder just pays a fixed, easily countable fee, say 200 rupees, for every single passenger that boards a plane. It's incredibly transparent and dispute-free.
And we absolutely cannot forget Udan Uday Deshka Amnagrik, the regional connectivity scheme.
Right. That scheme heavily uses the viability gap funding we talked about earlier. The government essentially subsidizes a certain number of seats on flights to very small towns to make the tickets affordable, capped at around 2,500 rupees per hour of flight. Airlines wouldn't fly to these remote places otherwise because it wouldn't be profitable. It's a direct investment in connecting the hinterland to the main economic grid.
Moving to the ocean economy. Ports. How do we handle our massive coastline?
In the port sector, India has largely adopted what is globally known as the landlord model. Under this, the government-owned port trust acts solely as the landlord. They own the physical land, they manage the security, and crucially, they manage the capital-intensive dredging, which means constantly digging out the sand from the ocean floor so giant ships don't get stuck.
So the government does the heavy background infrastructure? What does the private sector do?
The private players are invited to build and operate the actual cargo terminals. They bring in the massive automated cranes, the container tracking software, and they handle the actual loading and unloading of ships. So the government is the landlord, and the private sector is the highly efficient tenant operator. This model has drastically improved the turnaround times at major Indian ports.
And finally, energy and mining. This is so critical for our future.
It is the bedrock of the economy. We've seen a massive shift here from the opaque era of captive mines, where a steel plant would just be arbitrarily allocated a coal mine exclusively for itself, to highly transparent, open commercial auctions. Anyone can bid for a mine and sell the coal on the open market.
And what about the massive push for green energy?
This is where the biggest numbers are. India has a staggering renewable energy target of 500 gigawatts by 2030. The infrastructure investment required for solar parks, wind turbines, and massive battery storage is astronomical. The government budget cannot possibly fund even a fraction of that. It absolutely requires hundreds of billions in private global capital.
Okay, so we have all these ingenious models. We have undeniable progress on the ground. But any UPSC aspirant knows it's not all sunshine and rainbows. We have to analyze the flaws. Section 6. Challenges, critique, and future outlook. What is going wrong with PPPs in India?
A lot. And the definitive source you must cite in your answers here is the Kelkar Committee report on revisiting and revitalizing the PPP model. One of the biggest structural issues they identified is rigid contracts. Think about it. These concession agreements run for 30 or 40 years. You simply cannot predict the state of the world 30 years from now.
No one predicted a global pandemic or a massive war disrupting supply chains.
Exactly. But historically, our contracts lacked flexibility. If a black swan event happened and the private player begged to renegotiate the terms because they were facing bankruptcy, the government bureaucrats would refuse. Why? Because bureaucrats are terrified of the three C's, the CBI, the CVC, and the CAG. If a bureaucrat alters a contract to help a private company, they might be investigated for corruption. So projects just completely stalled in rigid legal gridlock.
And then there's the whole crony capitalism accusation. That is a heavy political issue.
It is, and it often stems from aggressive bidding. Companies would deliberately bid impossibly low, unviable prices just to legally win the initial contract, banking entirely on their deep political connections to force the government to renegotiate favorable terms for them later on. Or they would win, realize the math doesn't work, and just abandon the project midway.
Vivek Singh mentions the Tadamundra power plant as a case study here, right?
Yes, the ultra-mega power project. It's a very complex case where totally external global factors, specifically an unexpected change in Indonesian law regarding the export price of their coal, suddenly made the Indian power plant completely financially unviable because it relied on that cheap imported coal. It led to years of bitter legal battles over whether the tariff could be renegotiated. It highlights how vulnerable these mega projects are to global shocks.
All of this stalled infrastructure leads directly to the twin balance sheet problem, which was famously coined by the former chief economic advisor.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle. The infrastructure companies have massive bloated debt on their balance sheets and they can't pay it back because their projects are stuck. So consequently, the public sector banks have massive NPAs, non-performing assets, or bad loans on their balance sheets. The banks are too scared to lend to new projects, and the infrastructure companies are too broke to borrow. Total gridlock. Investment completely stops.
And what about land acquisition? Every time I read the news, a highway is stalled because of protests over land.
It remains the single biggest hurdle. Regulatory delays, environmental clearances, and acquiring farmland. It literally takes years. Remember, under the Constitution, land is a state subject, while national highways are a central subject. That adds a massive layer of political and bureaucratic friction.
So how is the government attempting to fix this mess? What are the new master frameworks?
You need to know three big acronyms here: NIP, NMP, and PM Gati Shakti. We already touched on the NMP, the National Monetization Pipeline, which is leasing out the brownfield assets to raise cash.
Right. And what is the NIP?
The NIP is the National Infrastructure Pipeline. It is a comprehensive, multi-year vision document outlining a mind-boggling 111 lakh crore rupee investment requirement across all sectors. But what is really interesting for students to note is the funding split they envision. They project the center will fund 39%, the states will fund 39%, and the private sector will fund 22%.
That is interesting. Despite all our talk of PPP, it shows the government acknowledges it still has to do the vast majority of the heavy lifting.
Exactly. Private capital is a supplement, not a replacement for state funding. And then there is PM Gati Shakti. This is arguably the most transformative administrative reform. It is a massive, unified digital master planning platform designed specifically to break down the notorious silos between different government ministries.
What do you mean by silos? Like lack of communication?
Yeah. Yes, historically it was a joke. The road ministry would proudly build a pristine new highway. Then, literally the next week, the telecom ministry would come and dig massive trenches right through the new road to lay optical fiber cables. Then the water department would come dig it up again. Massive waste of public money.
It's infuriating to watch. So Gati Shakti fixes that.
Yes. It uses advanced geospatial technology to map out every single infrastructure layer. Now, all 16 key ministries have to coordinate their planning on this single digital portal so everyone knows exactly what everyone else is doing years in advance. It integrates the planning of roads, railways, ports, and telecom right from the conceptual stage.
Now, Sanjeev Verma mentions one more very intriguing P in his book. He talks about the PPPP model. What is that extra P?
It stands for Public-Private People Partnership, and this is absolutely crucial for the long-term sustainability of any infrastructure in a vibrant democracy. The idea is that if you are building a massive dam or a new highway cutting through villages, you cannot just impose it from Delhi. You desperately need the local stakeholders deeply involved from day one.
So like consulting with local panchayats or farmer cooperatives.
Exactly. Or involving water user associations in irrigation projects, or utilizing ASHA workers in health infrastructure. If the local people aren't treated as genuine genuine partners, if they feel alienated or displaced, you inevitably get massive protests, legal injunctions, and endless delays. You need what we call the social license to operate.
It really connects beautifully back to the bottom-up Gandhian approach we talked about at the very beginning, doesn't it?
It really does. It brings the focus back to the human element of development.
Now, before we wrap this massive deep dive up, we absolutely need to look at how the UPSC actually frames questions around all this theory. We've mentioned a few PYQs, but let's look closely at the patterns, because knowledge without application is useless for the exam.
Completely agree. Let's look at the 2022 mains paper. They asked a very direct two-part question. Why is PPP required in infrastructural projects? Examine the role of PPP model in the redevelopment of railway stations.
Okay, so for the first part, you can't just write a generic sentence like the government needs more money, right?
No, that will get you very poor marks. You have to explicitly discuss the severe capital constraints of the government budget relative to the massive NIP targets. You have to discuss the critical need for advanced private sector technology, their superior project execution speed, and their operational efficiency.
And for the railway part of the question.
You specifically talk about the Habibganj model. You discuss how passengers now demand modern, world-class amenities, retail, hygiene, safety, that the private real estate sector is simply much better at designing and maintaining than the traditional railway bureaucracy. You show how commercializing the station airspace makes the model viable.
What about the 2013 mains question regarding the food subsidy bill? That seems like an agriculture or welfare question, not an investment question.
That is the beauty of the mains exam. Everything is interconnected. The question asked about WTO concerns regarding our massive food subsidies. But a brilliant answer will link this directly back to infrastructure investment. Think about it. Why do we have to give such massive subsidies? Partly because farmers are so poor. Why are they poor? Because nearly 30% of our fresh produce rots before it reaches the market.
Because we lack cold storage and refrigerated trucks.
Exactly. If we had better, massive private investment in agricultural supply chain infrastructure, which is a prime PPP opportunity, we wouldn't have nearly as much food wastage. Farmers' incomes would naturally rise. If they earn more naturally, the government might not need to pass such massive, legally binding subsidy bills that anger the WTO. Better physical investment literally reduces the fiscal need for subsidies.
That is a brilliant multi-dimensional connection. That is exactly what examiners are looking for. And lastly, let's look at the 2017 prelims question on the domestic content requirement for solar power.
Right. That question directly links to the constant tension between wanting massive foreign investment, but also wanting to aggressively protect our domestic manufacturing base. The government tried to force foreign solar developers to only use expensive Indian-made solar panels if they wanted the contracts. The U.S. took us to the WTO and struck it down as illegal protectionism. It perfectly illustrates how complex global investment rules really are.
Wow. So bringing this whole epic journey all together, we've gone from Mahalanobis betting everything on giant state-owned steel plants to the modern era of Gati Shakti and sophisticated Haim contracts. We've gone from a mindset of the government must build everything to a much more nuanced reality where the government master plans and manages the risk while the private sector executes the work.
It really has been a profound national journey from rigid ideology to necessary pragmatism. And the core takeaway for the listeners is this. Investment is the bridge. It is the absolute indispensable physical bridge between a developing India and a developed India. A country cannot simply consume its way to prosperity through subsidies and handouts. It fundamentally has to invest and build its way there.
But I want to leave our listeners with one final provocative thought, a real nugget to chew on as you review your notes tonight.
Go for it. Here is the big question. As we move so aggressively toward monetization, leasing out our roads and stations under the NMP, and as we push for more privatization, are we truly ensuring inclusive growth? The fundamental goal of the private sector is ruthless efficiency and maximizing profit. But the fundamental goal of the democratic public sector must be equity and welfare.
It's a massive friction point.
It is. When you hand over vital public utilities, our highways, our railway stations, and eventually maybe even our municipal water supplies to private profit-seeking monopolies, are we risking pricing the poorest citizens completely out of the system? Finding the optimal balance between the cold efficiency of private capital and the warm equity of public welfare is arguably going to be the single defining economic challenge for Indian policymakers over the next decade.
That is a really heavy thought to end on. Because ultimately, if a new expressway is an absolute engineering marvel, but the toll is 500 rupees a day, who is that road actually built for?
Exactly. Is it for the citizen or just for the balance sheet?
Well, on that philosophical note, we have finally reached the end of this massive deep dive, a huge reminder for everyone still with us. If this detailed breakdown helped clarify things for you, please take a second to like the video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Simplified UPSC by PPP.
Yes, and please go to the public Telegram channel right now to download the free notes and those crucial practice questions we discussed.
And if you want the real edge, DM to join the private library for the premium organized notes and the model mains answers. Finally, if you are capable, please support the team on Patreon. It's truly what keeps this entire project alive.
Thank you all so much for listening. Keep learning and always keep questioning the models.
See you in the next deep dive.